Alright folks, today I thought I would tell you a little bit about some of the lizards that we have, which come from a very special clade or grouping of lizards called the Iguanians. Now, Iguanians include your iguanas, which are primarily from the Americas, your agamas, which are from the Old World, and your chameleons. Now, these two guys here are bearded dragons, and bearded dragons are agamas, essentially, that come from Australia. Now, one of the things that defines Iguanians as a clade is that all of them use their tongue in some way to help them catch or eat food. So, if we look at our friends the bearded dragons here, when they eat, you'll see that they don't actually grab the food straight away with their jaws. They'll stick their tongue out a little bit, and there's a very, very sticky end to that tongue that can grab the insect. The bearded dragon then draws it back into its mouth and then it eats it. So they use their tongue almost in the same way as a miniature chameleon would. Actually, I'll pause myself there to explain a bit more and to help illustrate the difference between Iguanians and other lizards. If we first look at an Iguanian lizard like a chameleon, you can see really obviously how it shoots its tongue out to grab prey before drawing it back into its jaws. Now let's look at a non-Iguanian blue-tongued skink feeding. These belong to a different clade, and by clade I mean a biological grouping of animals that once shared a common ancestor, and in the case of these lizards, share similar biomechanical traits. So yeah, these guys are in a clade called Scleroglossa, and as you can see, rather than grabbing the food with their tongue, they catch prey simply by biting down on it with their jaws. Anyway, hope that all helps a little bit. Back to the beardies now. Now, both of these guys here are central bearded dragons, so they come from outback Australia, primarily around the very dry desert shrub areas. But bearded dragons as a whole include quite a few species, so as well as say your inland bearded dragons, you also get coastal bearded dragons, and you get Rankin's bearded dragons as well. Now, beardies like these guys are very, very common in captivity in the UK, and that's because they're relatively easy to look after for a lizard. You can see as well that they tame down pretty nicely. These guys aren't trying to run away, aren't trying to jump. They're pretty happy and content being handled by me, which is a great bonus because it means that they don't get stressed easily in captivity. Now, bearded dragons, like all lizards and in fact like all reptiles, have very, very scaly, dry skin. You can see it there. It's not slimy at all like you would get with an amphibian like a frog. It's really, really dry. Now, these scales here are impermeable to water, so what that means is, unlike a frog or a salamander that's an amphibian which doesn't have the scales and could therefore dry out in the sun, these guys can live in very, very hot, dry places, and they can retain as much moisture as possible inside their bodies because of those scales. They don't sweat or anything like that, so they really can lock up a lot of water, and that makes these guys, like most lizards, great at surviving in very hot, dry areas of the world. So the patches that you can see on some of these guys here are essentially areas where dead old skin has been shed and the fresh new skin is a different colour because it hasn't yet been changed by the colour of the dust coming off the sand in their enclosure. And when they shed their skin, another term for it is dermal ecdysis, so basically, yeah, the shedding of one's skin. Here we go, so these are our Rankin's dragons, which basically look like baby bearded dragons, but these guys are pretty much full grown already. So they're very, very closely related to bearded dragons. They just get, as you can see, quite a lot smaller. Now, Rankin's dragons also come from Australia, and you can see they're very similar to the beardies. They're pretty hand tame, and it doesn't really take much to tame them down at all, which again makes them brilliant because they don't get too stressed in captivity generally. Now, these guys, when they're ready to mate and a male is trying to look for a female partner, they do this kind of push-up action where they bob their heads and essentially look like they're performing push-ups, and that helps to attract them, females. Now, generally you'll find that most Iguanians will do that head bobbing action in some way to attract a mate, and you can find with some species that they'll have really nicely coloured throats, or they'll have a dewlap, flap of skin which is brightly coloured, and that helps to accentuate that head bobbing and therefore stands a better chance of finding a mate. Alright, so our next dude here is another agama, and this is a Chinese water dragon, and he's absolutely stunning. So this guy is a male, and generally in this species the males get quite significantly bigger built than the females, and they also end up with these really heavy set jaws. So you can see here his jaw has this really bulbous muscular outside of it, which the females do not have. So Chinese water dragons come from, you guessed it, China, and they also come from mainland Southeast Asia as well. They live in subtropical rainforests, and one of the reasons they get their name water dragon is because they're normally found quite close to water. In fact, typically in the wild they'll be seen basking on a branch that's maybe overhanging a river, and that means if they get scared at all and they think a predator is going to be able to eat them, they can just jump off that branch straight into the river below and swim away to freedom. So a really cool lizard feature that's perfectly demonstrated in Chinese water dragons is a feature on the top of the head called the parietal eye. Now, don't be thinking it's a really well formed eye, it isn't. In fact, when I show it to you, you're not going to think it's an eye at all. It's literally this little divot of scales here, and one scale is a little bit bigger than the others. That scale is essentially the visible part of the parietal eye. Now, what the parietal eye is used for essentially is it helps these animals with their circadian rhythm. So that is the day, night and seasonal cycles that they go through. So, as an example, what this parietal eye can do is it can sense when there's less daylight hours that comes with the changing of the seasons as you get towards winter, for example, and that will be able to tell the lizard to either eat more, rest a bit more, or look for a mate according to what time of year it is. And the parietal eye is able to go straight into the brain and essentially communicate that to the rest of the lizard. If I hold this dude like this, you can see he's got this slight ridge, this slight crest on his back, and also an ever so slight crest on the tail. And the tail, you'll notice, is pretty long. It's about twice as long, in fact, as the length of the animal itself that we can measure from the snout to the vent length, so where the cloaca starts. And this makes the tail actually really quite powerful. It's quite muscular. It's obviously got this dorsal crest which flattens it laterally, and what that means is when the lizard swims it can move its tail from side to side, and this will propel it through the water quite quickly. Alright, these next two little guys are collared lizards, and they come from the southwestern part of the United States and Mexico. Now, you might be looking at these two here and thinking, are they actually the same species? Because they look quite different, don't they? So, the animal in my left hand is actually a female collared lizard, while this one here in my right hand is a male. Now, these guys exhibit sexual dimorphism. And sexual dimorphism is where a male of one species can look very different from a female of the same species. So a great example of sexual dimorphism can be seen in birds of paradise, where the male is beautifully and flamboyantly coloured and the female almost looks like a blackbird. So with collared lizards, the male is quite more extravagantly coloured than the female. Now, one thing that makes these animals a little bit different from other lizards is that they have the ability to run bipedally. Now, bipedally, or bipedal locomotion, as it's otherwise known, is to walk on two legs, as opposed to quadrupedal locomotion, where you walk on four legs. Now, these guys will spend most of their day walking quadrupedally, so they'll walk on all four legs, just like most other lizards. However, if they end up getting really scared by a potential predator, they are actually capable of being able to stand upright on their back legs and run as fast as they can, just like miniature dinosaurs. Alright, so next up we have another one of my favourites. This here is a frill dragon, and she comes from Australia and also Papua New Guinea. Now, frill dragons are very good climbers, so you can see she's holding on to me nice and tight here. Now, one of the reasons frill dragons are such good climbers is actually they're semi-arboreal by nature. So that means that half of the time they normally will live up in the trees, and in fact they only come to the ground occasionally, either to lay eggs, try and catch a little bit of food, but most of the time they're a lot more at home up in a tree where they feel safe and secure. Now, one of the things that makes these guys famous, and where they get their name from, is this beautiful frill that drapes around the neck. This frill can essentially be used as a defence mechanism. So if the frill dragon ever feels threatened at all, and an animal is coming up to it and it looks like it's going to get eaten, it can either run away bipedally, just like collared lizards do, or if it chooses to try and scare the predator off, it can stand up on its back legs, open its frill as big as it can, and open its mouth really wide. And what this does is it makes the frill dragon look a lot bigger and hopefully intimidating enough that a predator isn't going to want to try and eat it. Now, a frilled dragon is able to erect its frill using a special bone at the base of its throat called the hyoid bone or hyoid apparatus. It's the same bone that chameleons use to shoot their tongue forwards. However, in a frilled dragon, that same bone goes backwards and the frill attaches to the end of the bone. So when the frilled dragon opens its mouth, it's able to activate that hyoid apparatus, and that basically extends the frill outwards in the same way as you would put up an umbrella. As you can see, they're great little creatures, and I dare say that if it was warm enough outside, she'd happily let me walk around with her perched on my shoulder for a good half an hour. Alright, so next up we've got some chuckwaller, and chuckwaller come from a pretty similar area as the collared lizards actually, so southwest corner of America and northwest of Mexico. So again, very, very dry, desert, arid, xeric places. Now you can see they're both really, really quite dark in coloration. In fact, the male, which is this one here, is pretty much completely black, and that really dark colour helps them to absorb heat when they're basking, when they're sunbathing, and the darker they are, the quicker they'll warm up, and therefore the quicker they can get going about their business during the day once the sun's risen. Now, it's generally so dry where these guys come from that there isn't normally much standing water for them to drink, and in fact these guys are able to get pretty much all of their water requirements from the food they eat, which is vegetation. Now, through eating so much dry vegetation where they naturally live, they can end up accumulating quite a lot of salt through the food that they're eating, and in order to get rid of that excess salt so it doesn't damage them, they've got a special gland which allows them to essentially extract the salt from their blood and sneeze it out. Alright, so last but definitely not least, we've got our Moroccan Uromastyx, otherwise known as a dabtail or dab lizard. Now, as the name suggests, these guys come from Morocco as well as a load of other countries in North Africa, and they're desert specialists, so quite similar to the chuckwallers, they're very, very tolerant of really, really hot conditions. And if I show you his vivarium, you'll see that his thermostat at the hotspot is set to about 42 degrees Celsius, and rest assured they can raise themselves a lot higher in terms of body temperature without any kind of ill effects. So they're real sun lovers, even amongst lizards. Now, a little bit like the chuckwaller I've just showed you, these guys are also herbivorous. They'll have the odd insect if they ever come about it in the wild, but otherwise about 99% of their diet is made up of vegetation. So just like the chuckwaller, they are actually able to excrete any excess salts from their nose, and they'll sneeze it out in a very similar way to the chuckwaller. So just like the chuckwaller, they live in deserts, are pretty much completely herbivorous and eat vegetables, and they can also sneeze out any excess salt. All of these characteristics they share with chuckwallers, but they are not closely related at all. So these guys come from the continent of Africa, while chuckwallers come from the continent of North America. So very, very far apart. But this is an example of something called convergent evolution. Now, convergent evolution is where identical characteristics evolve completely separately in species that look quite similar and live in similar niches but in completely different areas of the world. And the reason these similar characteristics evolve even though the lizards aren't closely related is just because these characteristics are really, really good at allowing these animals to survive in the habitats that they occupy, which, even though they're on different continents, are very, very similar in as much as they're very dry, not much water, very, very hot as well. Now, one of the things you'll notice is different between these guys and the chuckwaller is that this Uromastyx here has a very, very spiky tail, and this tail is essentially used as a form of defence. So these animals are very, very good burrowers, and in fact in the wild they can burrow several feet underground. And what they're able to do once they've dug their burrow, gone all the way down to it, maybe a good 6 feet underground, is they will go in head first. And what that means is if any predators come down the burrow looking for a tasty meal, they're going to be met with the tail end of this guy. And as you can see, that tail, pretty spiky, you wouldn't really want to mess with it. And in fact, if you irritate them enough, they can swing that tail from side to side. So say a snake or a mammalian predator managed to make its way down the burrow, they're just going to be getting hit repeatedly in the face by this really spiky tail. And that pretty much sums up all of the Iguanian lizards that we've got here. So yeah, hopefully you'll find, just like me, that they're a really interesting group of lizards.